Dear friends, this right here is love. Not that we loved God, but still he gave his son just to save us, and sacrifice for us. And since God loved us, then we also ought to love one another. And if God is love, whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. And if you don't know love and you don't know God, let it change who we are.
So we're going to be in Colossians chapter 1. And this is a book today. My goal is simply to kind of introduce to you why is this sermon series called Awake. For you sophomores, you might have seen that video before. We did a series with the same video called Acedia, right? And this video is one of those things where I was working with our video guy, our creative guy for this series called Awake. And this video with Tanner's voice, it was like too good not to double down on. And so freshmen, this is new for you. Some of you sophomores, you've seen that before. But just in light of recent events with Tanner, I was like, you know what? I want to use this one more time. I want to double down on this sermon series. And so the reason it's called Awake is we're going to be, I'm going to give you a lens to look through at this series in Ephesians chapter 5 here. But Colossians is a book, if you want to just jot this down, I like doing this in my Bible personally, like at the top of the Bible, where it says Colossians. I like writing down things like, this is a letter written by Paul. Okay? This is a letter written in the year 62 AD. So if you think big picture timeline, Jesus was born roughly when? It's not a trick question. 0. Okay? Some people say 3-ish AD, right? But for the most part, the reason time is split in and of itself, BC AD, is because of the birth of Jesus. So we know through his life, through the Bible, through certain history texts that he died probably somewhere around 30, mid-30s, okay? Some people say 33, 34, somewhere in there. So if this book was written in 62 AD, this is relatively a short period of time after Jesus has died. Okay, so the context for when this was written and who it was written to is really important. Why? Because the Bible is not written to us, but it is written for us. And that's a really important detail. Right? That's why if you ever see somebody like write on their shoes, like Philippians, whatever, and they go, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, and they write it on their cleats, and they're like, I can score a touchdown through Christ who strengthens me. It's like, I like the sentiment, right? Like I like where you're going with that, but that's actually not what the Bible means. That's not how the Bible was meant to be read. Like it was never meant to be taken like one verse and just like pull that thing out and just like place it on a cleat and think that I can score touchdowns through Christ who strengthens me. Now, can you play football in such a way that honors God? Absolutely. But Paul wasn't writing to you, football player, when he said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He's actually talking about, I've lived with like extreme wealth, and then I've lived with extreme poverty. I've been beaten, I've been stricken, I've been snake bitten, I've been shipwrecked, and I've learned the secret to be content, Paul says in Philippians. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Context really matters, right? Does that make sense? So sometimes when we pull a verse out and we put it on a coffee mug, we really miss what the Bible is actually trying to teach us. So things like, hey, who was this written by? Who was it written to? When was it written? Why was it written? These are all really, really important details. Okay, so your first fill in the blank there says this. It says, Colossians, Paul's challenge to have a greater devotion to Jesus. Paul's challenge to have a greater devotion to Jesus. Hey, this is the overarching theme of the book of Colossians. This is Paul's writing to the church of Colossae, and he's in prison writing this letter, and his challenge to them is to have this greater devotion to Jesus. And now, why is he challenging them to have a greater devotion to Jesus? Because they were facing cultural pressures tempting them to turn away from Jesus. They were facing cultural pressures. That's your next fill in the blank there. They're facing cultural pressures tempting them to turn away from Jesus. Now, we use this definition a lot in 9:10. We use the definition of temptation. We say temptation is what? It's an appeal to believe a lie. Good. It's an appeal to believe a lie. So go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. Right? The snake slithers up to Adam and Eve and says, did God really say? Right? 4 infamous words. Did God really say? Right? All temptation. It's this appeal to believe a lie. So it's this disinformation. It's an alternative reality. And so what the church of Colossae is facing is they're facing these cultural pressures around them that's tempting them to turn away from Jesus. So if all temptation is an appeal to believe a lie, the church of Colossae is already introduced to the good news of the gospel. And so Paul wants to double down on, hey, don't believe the cultural appeals to believe a lie that there's something better out there than following Jesus. And you know what makes me laugh a little bit? There's nothing new under the sun. Have you ever heard that phrase before? There's nothing new under the sun. It's a biblical phrase. It's a guy named Solomon said it. And he was, in biblical terms, the wisest person to ever walk the earth. He asks God for the gift of wisdom, and God grants it to him. And he writes books in your Bible like Ecclesiastes. Right? He writes Song of Solomon. He writes these letters, these wisdom literature, and he goes, hey, I'm going to talk to you about what it looks like to apply this knowledge and live it out. And wisdom says there's nothing new under the sun. So 62 AD, what year is it this year? 2023, okay? It is currently 2023. It's not 62 AD, okay, believe it or not. I kind of wish we could time travel, though, and I think we would all be a lot more grateful for the things that we think are normal in our life, right? Like turning a tap on and potable water coming out of that tap, right? Like the hot shower that maybe you took this morning, right? The car that you drove. Like if you just walked around in 62 AD, I think all of our life expectancy would be like max 3 years, like max. I don't think 2023 humans could like actually survive in 62 AD. Like if you just plucked you out of 2023 and dropped you in 62 AD, I think we would all be like dead within months, okay? Some of you minutes, okay? Be like, nope, they're dead. They're not going to make it. Okay, but it's interesting that Paul's writing to the church of Colossae going, hey, I'm going to write to you because there's these cultural appeals that I'm watching pull you away from the gospel. He goes, I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to invite you in to have this greater devotion to Jesus. And I read this and I go, LOL, me too, Paul. Right? Like if I have one goal in the 2 years that I'm the NineTen pastor, if me and Charlene sit down and I sit down with our NineTen team and I go, okay, what do we want to push and challenge these NineTen students with? Spring of 2023, sophomores, your last couple of months in NineTen, freshmen, your last couple of months before you lead this ministry. And honestly, my challenge is this. Hey, I want you to have a greater devotion to Jesus. Why? Because there's cultural pressures that are going to be these temptations that are going to tempt you to believe a lie that there's something out there that's better than Jesus. Right, we have a term in NineTen called getting boyfriended or getting girlfriended. And guess what happens? Guess what I've seen 1,000 times over the last 5.5 years? Somebody gets a girlfriend, somebody gets a boyfriend, and then it's like, they're like gone with the wind, right? And it's not like they went, I have a girlfriend now, therefore I don't believe in Jesus. No, I said this at camp, and I'll say it again here. My greatest fear for you, NineTen, is not that you like find some proof that Jesus doesn't exist. My greatest fear is that there will be a temptation to believe a lie that something else is actually better for you, that something else can satisfy, that something else can fulfill, that there's something in your immediate purview right here, right now, that is like this. It feels good right here, right now, therefore I neglect all other things. This is temptation. If you've ever given into a temptation, you're saying, I want immediate gratification, and I'm going to neglect what is I know to be best for me. Does that make sense? So I love this series where we can go, hey, we want to dive into the book of Colossians. I would love for us to study even the book of Colossians outside of a Sunday morning, to be reading it, to be prepared to come in, to be prepared to walk into your life group. Why? Because I think this is going to be a series that applies to every single one of us in this room. Okay, so turn back to, you. Hopefully you kind of jotted some note downs about Colossians, but I want to spend the rest of the time actually in Ephesians. And you're like, wait, what? I thought we were in Colossians. This is going to be a lens. Okay, this is going to be a lens to look through for the rest of this series, and we're going to spend the rest of our time this morning just taking a deep dive into this lens. How do we read the book of Colossians? And it's another letter of Paul's where he's going to talk to us about what what does it look like to live this life, walking this life out as a Jesus follower? So if you're sitting in this room and you would call yourself a follower of Jesus, right? I believe in today's day and age, the word Christian can mean like a bazillion different things, right? It's like, I'm from Georgia, I'm a Christian. And you're like, what? What does Georgia and Christianity have anything to do with each other, right? Or you can find yourself going like, I'm a Christian, which means like politically, this is where I stand. And so I'm just, for the sake of this series, I'm going to use the term follower of Jesus. So if you're sitting in this room, you're a follower of Jesus, this entire series is going to challenge you. How does that become the steps that you take daily? Not a philosophical ideology for your life, but a daily walk, a daily, every single day, a Monday, a Thursday, that you just go, today I'm a follower of Jesus, tomorrow I'm a follower of Jesus. This is the primary lens and through which I view life. Okay, so Ephesians chapter 5, Paul gives us a little bit of a challenge on how to do that. Okay, so chapter 5, verse 8. And in honor of my boy Braden, who's been sick for like 2 weeks now, if you're there, say, preach. That was like a solemn preach, which is appropriate because Braden's sick. He texted me this morning so frustrated. He was like, I'm still freaking sick. He wants to be here so bad, but he'd be coughing all over you. So nobody wants that. Okay, chapter 5, verse 8. For you were once in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. Okay, underline that phrase, live as children of light. For the fruit of light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes light. This is why it's said, wake up, sleeper. Rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Be very careful then how you live, not as the unwise, but as the wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. Sing and make music from your heart to the Lord, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out here is he says, expose the fruitless deeds of darkness. Okay, in verse, where is that? Once darkness walks with the light, have nothing to do with these fruitless deeds of darkness in verse 11. Okay, I love this imagery here. Okay, I love the imagery of the fruitless deeds of darkness. Anybody ever tried to garden in here? You ever try to like plant something and hope and expecting you've like seen something on Pinterest or you've watched a YouTube video for this like bountiful harvest? And then a lot of the times, like I feel like there's multiple types of gardeners, right? Or like there's the type of gardener that like you're just a natural green thumb. And then there's the type of gardener that's probably a little bit more like me, that you manage to kill everything you've ever gardened. Right? And I love this word, fruitless. Right? This word goes like, hey, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness. And it gives us this incredible imagery to go, there is light and there is dark. There really isn't an in-between. Act as children of the light, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness. And so I would almost give you this homework this week, this challenge, and this is one of those things I want us to talk about in life groups this week, is what are the examples of things in our life that lead to fruitless deeds of darkness? Because if we want to avoid these appeals to believe a lie, a lot of the times the hard work that comes with daily following Jesus comes before the temptation hits. Does that make sense? Like a lot of the times we wait until we're tempted, and then the appeal to believe a lie comes, and then we go, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And a lot of the times what we challenge you with in NineTen is to go, hey, how do you do the hard work of identifying what are the things that lead to fruitless deeds of darkness in your life? So that way, when you arrive at a temptation, you're prepared for that moment. Right? There's a beautiful passage in Matthew chapter 4, and it's found in a couple of the other Gospels, where Jesus is faced by temptation. And when he arrives at temptation, he's prepared for it. He's done the hard work to get there. It's why World War II was like one of the biggest travesties. Right? When you go D-Day, you took a bunch of people that you had drafted, a lot of like able-bodied 18-year-old Americans, and just dropped them into war with like a 6-week boot camp at most, and went like, good luck. Like, that's not the way that you prepare soldiers. Why now, whether you enlist or become an officer, before you go to war, why is there this intense process to go, we're going to prep you for that? It's because nobody was ever supposed to find themselves in a foxhole in the middle of war and go, I guess I'm ready. But I think we do this with temptation all the time. We just find ourselves in the midst of temptation, and we haven't done the work that it is to prepare ourselves. So I love this imagery, the fruitless deeds of darkness. How do we look at our life, take a big step back and go, are there things currently in my life that they're fruitless? They constantly lead me into a place where I'm not prepared to further devote myself to Jesus. They're actually things that pull me away. They're fruitless deeds. And number one. Number two, it says, live as children of light. I love this imagery. It says, for you were once in darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of the light. This light consists of, and it gives us three things: goodness, righteousness, and truth. Now, here's what goodness means. All things that are good in life, they come from God, who is good himself. It's one of the attributes of God. Right? All things, whether like clearly good in our life, or sometimes like the things that are less clear, like a sunrise, like oxygen in our breath, like the health that you have. You ever like lost the ability to breathe in your nose because you were sick? This ever happened to you? And then you're like, if I can breathe, like the second I can breathe again, I'm never going to take breathing out of my nose for granted ever again. Anybody ever make that statement before, right? And then you can breathe out of your nose again, and you're like, oh, thank God, I can breathe. And you're like smelling everything, and food tastes good again, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. And then how long does it take you to take that for granted again? Like 3 hours of breathing out of your nose? Maybe like you have 1 day of appreciation, and then it's just normal again. It's just like normal to breathe out of your nose. And then you lose it, and you're like, oh no, oh gosh, I can't breathe out of my nose. Right? It's like we take these things for granted. I love the term goodness. Walk as children of the light that lean into the good gifts that God gives us. Why? Because one of his attributes is that he is good. All things good in this world come from him, whether you recognize it or not. Right? And then the next one is righteousness. We spent a chunk of time talking about this last night in 910 plus. Righteousness means what? Right with God. So walk as children of the light. Friends, if you hear nothing else today, would you hear this? Would the gospel, the good news that once upon a time we were, what's the opposite of right with God? Wrong with God. Sinners. Right? That once upon a time we were wrong with God, and we now have the gift of the invitation of being right with God. He's saying, walk as children of the light. Would the regular pattern of your life be defined by the fact that you are now right with the God of the universe because of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection? Because of his sacrifice, we are now invited to be right with him. Would that be, how do we walk as children of the light? Put a gospel lens on daily. And then the last one is truth. Right, I love that Jesus in John chapter 14 defines himself as truth. He says, I am the way, I am the truth. Right? I am the life. Nobody gets to the Father except through me. All things that are right, good, and true come from him. So how do we walk as children of the light? Right, your next fill in the blank says this: to lean into Jesus and watch your appetites change. Lean into Jesus and watch your appetites change. I got to go down into the like deep Amazon jungle when I was living in Ecuador. I was in high school, and we went down to this little town called Shell Mera. And from Shell, we hopped on like this tiny little airplane. It was like the 5-seater Kodiak planes. And these are like missionary planes. So, and the missionary pilots, and these dudes are gnarly, right? We're like taking off, and I look out, there's like duct tape flapping on the wing. And I'm like, is that supposed to be there? Right? Like, is this thing good? He's like, oh, it's fine, right? I'm like, okay. And sure enough, we're like flying for 45 minutes and like over just like the thickest jungle you've ever seen in your life, right? This is like real life Jungle Book. And we're about to land, and he's like, hey, we're coming down on our descent, right? You know, in like a commercial airplane, they come down and they're like, ladies and gentlemen, like this is your final descent. This is your captain here. Like put down your seat tray tables, and you know the whole like spiel of a pilot as you're coming down into a descent. So the pilot just like, he does that, but there's 5 of us in the plane. So he just kind of turns around. He's like, hey, we're going to land. And I look out the window, and it's just trees. And I'm like, where? Like, where are we landing? And we come in, sure enough, like right before we land, you see like this tiny little opening in the trees, and there's like this grass runway that this village has carved out to get supplies, because walking from the village into town to get supplies, it takes days. So to fly in, they've cleared this little area in the jungle, and sure enough, this plane comes down, lands on the grass. And me and my dad and this team that we were with, we spent 2 weeks in here. And this was actually the community. They're called the Waodani Indians. And the Waodani they were the tribe of people that, if you've ever heard of the missionaries, there was like Nate Saint and a couple of other missionaries that came in, and they were going to evangelize, share the gospel with this tribe, and they ended up dying for it. There was this massive miscommunication. They were martyred for it. And then one of the missionaries who came in, his wife went back to the tribe after they murdered her husband and shared the gospel with them. And today there's a church in the middle of that tribe. And we got to spend 2 weeks in with this community, with this tribe. And I got to stand next to this dude. His name's Juwe. And I was standing next to this dude in a church service. By the way, in this church, there's like tarantulas overhead because there's tin roofs. And so the tarantulas come in at night to like chill in the heat of the tin roof. So that, like day one, y'all, it's like literally it's like worship, right? Like homies standing up here. Who am I to be? And I'm like, ooh, like the most terrifying church service I've ever been in. But it's like every night. Sure enough, like tarantulas come and they just kick it right there on the tin. And the Waodani Indians, they'll like grab the tarantulas and they'll crawl on them. Like they're next level, y'all. But I'm standing next to this dude, Juwe. And he's this old man who he was one of the guys back in the 60s. He was one of the guys that speared Nate Saint and Jim Elliott and these other missionaries. He was one of the guys who murdered them. And he's now standing in this church service, and I'm standing next to him singing, I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. And it was like one of the coolest moments of my life. But we're in here for 2 weeks. And the whole time we're in there, we're like bathing in the river, right? They're like, hey, don't worry, like this section of the river, there's like not any anacondas. Like that's more like a mile up. And I'm like, a mile up? The thing about rivers is a mile up is connected to right here. So like, and they're like, no, there's no anacondas here. And I'm like, right? Like tarantulas, snakes, like this place is next level, okay? Again, this is like, it's closer to 62 AD than 2023 is Southern California, okay? And we spend 2 weeks in here, we're eating like all natural rice and beans and like meat that they raise and they kill it, like everything. This is like Sprouts on steroids, y'all. Like everything's all organic, all farmed right there, raised, like free range everything. So for 2 weeks, this is what I eat. And I come back, and I remember like we packed up in the airplane, we said goodbye to everybody, and we land back in Shelmera. And we run over, and I sit on a toilet for the first time in 2 weeks. And I'm like, a toilet, right? This thing's amazing. And I go over to this little store, and I buy a pack of Oreos. And I take Oreos, and I'm like, I haven't had Oreos in 2 weeks, and I'm like craving Oreos. And I open up this pack of Oreos, and I just crush all 4 Oreos. And I'm like, oh, sweet sugar and preservatives, right? And I eat all 4 Oreos. And then you know what happens immediately? I feel like garbage. My stomach feels like horrible. So 2 weeks ago, I could eat Oreos and be fine, right? Like completely unaffected. And now, what's changed? Why all of a sudden, now that I'm eating preservatives, do I feel horrible? It's because for the last 2 weeks, I've been eating something that's not preservatives, that's not sugars, that's not Oreos. My body literally adapted, my appetites changed, and when I introduced something foreign into my body went, nah, reject, stiff arm. Hey, I believe wholeheartedly, friends. Ask any one of your leaders in here to tell you their story. And you'll hear some aspect of their story that once they put their hope and trust in Jesus, that there was something that shifted and changed in their life. There was an appetite shift for life, for what was important, for what was satisfying, for what was fulfilling. When you lean into Jesus, when you actively choose to follow him daily, watch how your appetites change. It says, wake up, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. This is where our theme comes from, to live awake to the reality that Jesus is Lord. And then it says, be very careful then how you live, not as the unwise, but as the wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Don't get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. Okay? And this is how I want to close. This is how I want to end this right here. Hey, there's a compare and contrast with getting drunk on wine and being filled with the Spirit. Right? Paul is intentionally putting these things on opposite sides. He's saying don't get drunk on wine. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. There's a direct comparison and contrast to this, okay? I was watching this movie this week with Piper, and this scene made me laugh out loud. So check this out.
Low battery. I'm a hooker for personal Baymax, man.
Kid, how about we call your parents and get them down here? What? Write your name and number down on this piece of paper and we can help.
I've got to get you home to your charging station. You walk.
I will scan you now. Scan complete. Okay.
Okay. My aunt asks we went to school all day. Got it.
We jumped out a window.
No. Quiet.
We jumped out a window.
Say this. That gas.
You home, sweetie?
That's right.
I thought I heard you. Right. Hey, Aunt Cass. Oh, look at my little college man. Oh, I can't wait to hear all about it. Oh, it means you're almost ready.
Whee!
All right, get ready to have your face melted. You're gonna feel these things tomorrow. Okay, sit down. Tell me everything.
Guys, it's so good. If you haven't seen Big Hero 6, highly recommend. Okay, it's a great movie. I just love that scene where he goes, we jumped out a window. He's like, shh, we jumped out a window. It's good, okay? So rather than talk about drunkenness, I figured I'd rather show you drunkenness, okay? But here's the thing about low battery, we'll call it, is what does Baymax need? Power. He just needs a charge, right? That's it. So when somebody gets drunk, if you've ever been around somebody who's drunk or watched a movie where somebody's drunk, here's the crazy thing about getting drunk on alcohol. You don't stay drunk forever, right? Like, luckily, it's not like somebody gets drunk and then it's like, well, I guess that's the rest of your life, right? It just like is what it is. And that's just like forever. No. So Baymax, they can play on this humor because he's acting drunk. But then he gets on a charge, he charges, and then he's good again. Yeah, but here's what's interesting that I think by the next phrase. It says, instead, be filled by the Spirit. I think there's a misnomer or a misunderstanding within Christianity that I surrender my life to Jesus, I put my hope and trust in him, I'm given the gift of Spirit, and now check, I'm a Jesus follower. And I love that Paul goes, don't get drunk on wine, instead be filled by the Spirit. You want to know why? Because getting drunk on wine is something that you do continually. So he's saying, don't do that. Instead, continually, daily, actively be filled by the Spirit. Okay, so that next number 3 says, be filled by the Spirit. Your 3A is active, daily filling. And I want to end with a little bit of a nerdy Greek lesson, okay? So be filled by the Spirit, active, daily filling, and then it says Greek lesson there on the bottom. And here's what I want you to write down. Okay, be filled in your Bible. Those words, those English words. Your Bible was actually not written in English. Your New Testament was written in Greek, okay? Your Old Testament was written in Hebrew. Good, okay? Your New Testament was written in Greek, mostly, a little bit of Aramaic. Okay, so your Greek lesson here is the two words "be filled." Your Greek, the tense that this is in is a present passive imperative. Okay, present passive imperative. And now you might be sitting here going, "Who cares?" Right? Like present passive imperative. I hate English and grammar and all of these things, and I came to church because I'm not school. Okay, but here's why I want you to know this. Present passive imperative. Hey, this is a tense that your New Testament authors, they use a lot. And this present passive imperative, it demonstrates an ongoing dailiness to the tense, right? So it's be filled by the Spirit. Is that a one-time thing? No. He's saying be filled, be being filled by the Spirit. Right? It's bad English, but it makes sense in Greek. Be being filled by the Spirit. Ongoing, active, be open to it. Romans 12 will say it like this. Don't conform to the patterns of this world. Rather, what? Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Same tense. Right? That's the same passive imperative going, be being transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's an ongoing stance of an openness, a willingness for God to come in and do the work. It's not us that does the work, but it is us that is open to receive him doing the work. Looking from the outside in, you might not see a big difference, but from the inside out, that is a massive difference when it comes to how is God at work in your life. Okay, so number one, what are the fruitless deeds in your life? Can we identify these? Number two, how are we doing walking as children of the light? Hey, how are we doing leaning into the goodness, the truth, the righteousness that God has given us, the lens through which we look? Lean into Jesus, watch your appetites change. And number three, be filled by the Spirit. Not once upon a time, but what does it look like to learn something, lean into something on Sunday that changes your Monday? Hey, this is the awake lens. We want to come back to these three things over and over and over again in Colossians and go, are we awake to the reality that is following Jesus? Or do we look asleep? Are we followers of Jesus, but we're asleep at the wheel? We would say, I'm a follower of Jesus, but our life doesn't demonstrate anything that is following Jesus. Paul would look at the person who's asleep at the wheel going, for sure, Jesus is Lord, but nothing looks at it in their life and go, hey, wake up. Awake, O sleeper, rise from the dead, walk as a child of the light. Flip the light switch on. Be aware of the fruitless deeds of the darkness, and then daily be filled by the Spirit. This is my prayer for you, NineTen. This was Paul's prayer back in 62 AD for the churches he was writing to. And would we be people that hear the words of Paul and not just let them go in one ear and out the other, but live this out? Okay, pray with me. God, thank you for tonight, or this morning, rather. Thank you for the opportunity, God, to just come together and just hear your word, God, read. And would we hear this, God, and be transformed by it? Would it soften our hearts? Would it open up our eyes and ears to see things the way that you see them? God, this week, would we flip the light switch on in our life? Would be aware of the fruitless deeds of darkness and just invite you in to walk daily with you. We love you. Thanks for loving us first. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen.